somewhere in the south of France, in a small stone room that smelled of ink and dried herbs, and the particular stillness of a house where everyone else has gone to sleep. An old man sat alone with a candle and a bowl of water. He was not performing a ritual. He was not summoning anything. He was thinking, the way certain minds think best, by going very quiet and very still, and waiting for the shape of something to become clear. He had been a physician for most of his life. He had walked into towns where plague had already taken half the population, and he had worked until his hands shook. He had lost a wife and children to the same disease he spent his career fighting. He had been questioned by authorities who found his ideas uncomfortable. He had survived all of it, not by being fearless, but by being careful and precise, and willing to look at things that other people preferred not to see. His name was Michel de Nostredame. The world came to know him as Nostradamus, and more than 450 years after his death, his name still appears every time the world feels like it is coming apart. Every war, every plague, every moment when the future suddenly feels less like something that will arrive gently and more like something bearing down. People open his book, they search his words, they find, or believe they find, something that looks like a warning that was always meant for now. Tonight we are not going to tell you what to believe about him. We are going to tell you who he actually was, where he came from, what he lived through, what he wrote and why he wrote it the way he did, what the historical record actually supports, and where the legend has grown far beyond the man. Because the true story of Nostradamus, the one that exists in the archives and the letters and the careful work of historians who have spent their careers with his actual documents, is more interesting than the myth. It is stranger, it is more human, and it raises questions that the myth, with all its satisfying certainty, never quite gets around to asking. Settle in, let the room go quiet. Let whatever you are carrying today set itself down for a little while. We are going to the south of France. We are going back 500 years, and we are going to meet the man before the legend found him. Chapter 1. The world he was born into. To understand Nostradamus, you have to understand the world that made him, not the world as a backdrop, something to mention briefly before moving on to the interesting parts. The world as the primary force shaping every choice he made, every word he chose, every layer of protective ambiguity he built around the things he most wanted to say. He was born on the 14th of December, 1503. In the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, in what is now the south of France. The town sat in a landscape of pale limestone and lavender fields, and the particular quality of light that the Mediterranean gives to the land closest to it. Clear and warm, and slightly golden, even in winter. It was a beautiful place to be born. It was also a complicated one. His family was Jewish by origin. More precisely, his family were conversos, Jews who had converted to Catholicism under pressure during the wave of forced conversions that had swept through France and Spain in the preceding century. The conversion was real in the legal sense. Whether it was real in any deeper sense was a question that families who had gone through it tended not to answer out loud. Because the Inquisition was still active, still watching, and still very much interested in whether converso families were practicing their old faith in private. This is the first thing to understand about the world he was born into. The line between safety and danger was not drawn by what you believed. It was drawn by what you could be made to appear to believe. A family with Jewish origins. No matter how genuinely they had embraced Catholicism, carried a vulnerability that could be activated at any moment by an accusation, a rumor, a neighbour with a grievance, or an official with a quota to fill. His grandfathers, on both sides, had been physicians and scholars before their conversion, men of education and standing in the Jewish communities they came from. After conversion, they navigated the new landscape with the careful intelligence of people who had learned that survival required knowing exactly how much of yourself to show and exactly how much to keep private. Later biographical tradition, writing decades after his death, suggests that one of his grandfathers played a significant role in his early education, introducing him to Latin, mathematics, astronomy, and the classical learning that would define his intellectual life. How much of this tradition reflects precise historical memory, and how much reflects the tendency to construct impressive origins for impressive figures is a question the surviving documentary record does not resolve cleanly. What the record does support is that he arrived at university with a level of preparation that his teachers found unusual, and that the household he grew up in clearly valued learning in a way that went beyond what the local school alone could have provided. He was a highly educated man by the standards of his milieu, but the education that shaped him most deeply was not the kind that came from books alone. It came from watching a family navigate the specific dangers of being something other than what the world required you to be, from learning, in the most direct and daily way, that the same idea could be expressed in ways that invited destruction or in ways that deflected it, that the difference between those two ways of expressing something was not dishonesty, it was survival. The broader world outside that house was not a peaceful one. Europe in the early 1500s was a continent reorganizing itself under pressures that no one yet fully understood. The printing press had been in operation for less than 50 years, and it was already doing what disruptive technologies do, accelerating the spread of ideas faster than the institutions designed to control ideas could manage. Martin Luther was a young man in those years, still more than a decade from the moment that would crack Western Christianity apart. But the conditions that made that crack inevitable were already present, and anyone paying close attention could feel the tension in the structure. The Ottoman Empire was pressing at the edges of Europe with a military force that had already taken Constantinople 50 years earlier and showed no signs of having found its natural limit. The Italian city-states were being fought over by France and Spain in a series of wars that disrupted trade, displaced populations, and demonstrated repeatedly that the political arrangements everyone had assumed were permanent were nothing of the kind. The Church was powerful and also visibly imperfect, a combination that produced not reform but anxiety. The particular anxiety of people who need an institution to be trustworthy and can see that it is not, and underneath all of this, moving through the population of Europe with a regularity that no prayer or politics had yet managed to interrupt, was plague. Not plague as a historical event that happened once and ended, plague as a recurring condition of life, the way drought or flood was a recurring condition, something that might not come this year or next year, but that was always somewhere on the horizon, always possible, always capable of arriving in a town and taking a third of the population before anyone had time to understand what was happening. The child growing up in Saint-Remy in the first decade of the 1500s, knew about plague the way children in other eras knew about other permanent dangers, not as a concept from a book, but as a fact of the world, something discussed in the household, prepared for in the way a family with medical knowledge prepared for it, with attention and with the particular kind of steadiness that knowledge sometimes, not always, but sometimes, provides. He was being shaped by all of this. The careful family, the layered education, the unstable continent, the permanent proximity of death. He was not yet a physician, not yet a writer, not yet the figure whose name would be printed on books and whispered in moments of crisis for the next 5 centuries. He was a boy in a stone house in Provence, learning what the household had to teach, watching the light change on the limestone hills, absorbing, without knowing he was absorbing it, the lesson that would define everything he later built. The lesson was this: the world is not as stable as it appears. The things people believe are permanent are often simply things that have not broken yet. And the most useful thing a careful mind can do is learn to read what is actually there, rather than what everyone around you has agreed to pretend is there. He was 12 years old. He had not yet left Provence. The roads that would take him into plague towns and across the length of France and into the court of a queen were still ahead of him. But the mind that would walk those roads was already forming, quietly, in a house that had learned, across generations, that the most dangerous thing you could do was let the world know exactly what you understood. Chapter 2. The Student Who Went the Wrong Way. Every institution of learning has always struggled with a particular kind of student, not the difficult one, not the rebellious one, not the one who causes trouble, because trouble is easier than work. The student who has already gone further than the curriculum and keeps pushing in directions the curriculum was not designed to go. The years he spent trying to find the education he needed taught him something that no classroom managed to teach him directly: that the most important knowledge is almost always found outside the place where knowledge is officially dispensed. He left Saint-Rémy sometime around 1517, when he was approximately 14 years old, to study at the University of Avignon. The university offered the standard curriculum of the era: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. For most students, this was the full scope of what a formal education was supposed to provide. For a boy who had arrived with the preparation his household had given him, it was a starting point at best. He stayed at Avignon for approximately a year before the university closed due to plague. That detail is worth pausing on. The institution of learning shut down because of the very thing that would define his professional life for the next decade. Plague did not respect the boundaries between the world of ideas and the world of bodies. It arrived in university towns the same way it arrived everywhere else. Without announcement, without concern for who had important work to finish. He returned home. He spent several years continuing to read, following the paths that interested him rather than the paths a formal curriculum would have assigned. He was developing, in those years of informal study, the habit of working across disciplines that would later make him genuinely difficult to categorize. In 1522, he enrolled at the University of Montpellier to study medicine. This was the most significant medical school in France and one of the most respected in Europe. It had a serious faculty, a rigorous program, and a tradition of producing physicians who were expected to know not just the texts but the practice. He was approximately 19 years old. He arrived with a level of preparation that impressed at least some of his teachers and created friction with others, because the kind of preparation he had was not exactly the kind the institution was designed to recognize. There is an entry in the university's records from this period indicating that he was expelled. The reason given in sources that several historians have examined relates to his having worked in a trade connected to medicine before completing his formal training, which the university's rules prohibited. It is worth being honest about the limits of what the record supports here, the specific circumstances of his departure, and whether this account represents the complete picture remain matters that scholars have not resolved with full certainty. What the record does tell us clearly is that the institution and the student had found the limits of their compatibility, and that he left. What happened next is one of the most important and least discussed periods of his life. For approximately 8 years, from the early 1520s to around 1531, he travelled through the south of France, working in regions where plague was present. He moved from town to town, going toward the outbreaks rather than away from them, working as a physician in the places where physicians were most desperately needed and least likely to be found, because most physicians with any choice in the matter were going in the other direction. His approach, reconstructed from his later writings and from accounts by people who observed him work, emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and the practical management of contamination. He declined to bleed his patients. He insisted on clean water. He prepared his own remedies using methods that departed significantly from the standard practice of the era. He could not have explained this in the language that a later century would use. He did not have the concept of germ theory, but he had watched enough people die and enough people survive to understand that something about the conditions of contamination mattered in ways that the inherited frameworks of his training did not account for, and he adjusted his practice accordingly. This is the thing about those 8 years that deserves the most attention. It is the evidence they provide of how he processed information. He was not a man who accepted the official explanation when his own observation contradicted it. He was a man who watched what was actually happening and drew his own conclusions, even when those conclusions put him at odds with every institution that certified what a physician was supposed to know and do. That quality is what made him effective as a physician. It is also what shaped the way he later wrote about the future, not because the two things are the same, but because they came from the same place in him. The same refusal to accept that the official version of reality was the complete one. He was building a reputation during these years, quietly, in the way that reputations build in communities small enough for word to travel. He was becoming known not as a theorist, not as a scholar, but as someone who showed up in the worst situations and did something that worked. He was also changing in ways that years in plague towns would change anyone. He had seen the speed at which the world could take everything from a person. He had watched families destroyed in days. He had worked in towns where the ordinary rhythms of community had simply ceased to function because too many of the people who maintained them were dead. He had survived all of it. He was in his late 20s. He had no degree, no institution behind him, no official standing. He had something harder to quantify and more difficult to take away. He had seen the thing that most people spend their lives arranging not to see directly, and he had not looked away. He was about to try to build something ordinary. A home, a family, a life with walls around it that the road could not reach. He did not yet know that the road was not finished with him. Chapter 3. The First Catastrophe. There are losses that a person absorbs and carries forward, the way a bone heals after a break, changed by what happened but functional, capable of bearing weight again. And there are losses that do something different, that reach into the structure of a person and rearrange it at a level so fundamental that the person who comes out the other side is not quite the same person who went in. What happened to Nostradamus in the early 1530s was the second kind. He had returned to Montpellier around 1529, several years after his earlier departure, and this time he was received differently. The years of documented work in plague towns had given him a practical record that the institution could not easily dismiss. He completed the requirements for his degree with a speed that suggested he had long since mastered the material they were testing him on, and received his doctorate in medicine. He stayed on at Montpellier for a period afterward, teaching, engaging with the scholarly community in the way that a man who has spent nearly a decade working alone in the field engages when he finally has colleagues to argue with. He was recognized as someone worth arguing with. He left Montpellier sometime around 1532, drawn to the household of Julius Caesar Scaliger in the town of Agen. Scaliger was one of the most formidable scholars in France, a humanist and classicist whose intellectual reputation reached across Europe. The two men were drawn to each other with genuine admiration and the particular tension that comes when two people, both accustomed to being the most interesting thinker in any given room, find themselves in the same room, in Agen. Nostradamus did something he had not done before. He settled. He married. The historical record here requires honest acknowledgement of its limits. The identity of his first wife is not established with certainty in the documents that have survived. Some sources offer a name, others do not. The scholars who have worked most carefully with this period are candid about what the record supports and what it does not. What we can say is that he married, that they had children together, and that the precise details of who they were are not fully preserved in the records that remain. What is preserved, what the record does support clearly, is what happened next. The plague came to Agen. Plague coming to a town where Nostradamus lived was not, by this point, a new experience. He had spent years walking toward outbreaks. He had developed methods that had worked in other places. He had a track record that was better than the standard practice of his era. None of it mattered. His wife died. His children died. The physician who had walked into plague towns and brought people out the other side could not save the people sleeping in the same house. The particular cruelty of this is worth sitting with, not to dwell on it for its own sake, but because it is essential to understanding everything that came after. He was a man whose professional identity was built on the ability to do something in the face of plague that other physicians could not or would not do. That ability was real. It had been demonstrated repeatedly, in towns across the south of France, in situations where the results were measurable, and then it failed, in the place where it mattered most, against the same disease. In his own house, the question that a loss like this puts to a person is not a philosophical one. Not at first. It is immediate and physical and completely without comfort. What is the value of knowing what you know, if it cannot protect the people you love? He had no good answer. Nobody does. The professional consequences arrived quickly. His patron Scaliger distanced himself. The relationship between them, already complicated by years of close proximity between two strong personalities, did not survive the combination of grief and professional failure. Patients who had valued him withdrew their confidence. There was also a legal dimension that added another layer of threat. He had made a remark at some point, the exact circumstances disputed in the sources, that had been interpreted as disrespectful toward a sacred image. The Inquisition took note. A man with converso origins, without a powerful patron, recently bereaved and professionally isolated, facing potential inquiry from an institution that had the power to end his life, was in a position that did not leave much room for anything except movement. He left Agen, he went back to the road. The years that followed, roughly 1534 to 1544, are the least documented period of his adult life. He moved. He worked. He continued to practice medicine where he could find patients who would have him. There are accounts placing him in various locations across southern France, and possibly in Italy. The historians who have worked most carefully with this period are candid about the limits of what the surviving record supports. He was moving. Beyond that, the specifics become difficult to verify. What we can sense, from the texture of his later writing and from the few accounts that do survive, is the quality of the experience. It was not the purposeful movement of a physician following the plague because he believed he could help. It was something closer to the movement of a man who has lost the anchor that held him in one place and has not yet found another. He was in his early 30s. He had built something in Agen, a household, a professional standing, a relationship with one of the most impressive minds in France. All of it was gone. There is a version of this story that moves quickly through this period, noting the tragedy briefly and pressing on to the more celebrated chapters. But the person who moves too quickly through the years after Agen misses something essential. The man who sat down in Salon de Provence in the 1540s and began writing the verses that would make him famous across centuries was not a man who had glided smoothly from education to achievement to recognition. He was a man who had been broken down to something very basic and had then rebuilt himself. Slowly, carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what the foundations cost. The loss in Agen did not make him a prophet, but it made him the specific kind of person who would eventually write what he wrote. A man who had looked at the fragility of everything people build and love and depend on, who had felt that fragility in the most direct way possible, and who had kept working anyway. Not because the working guaranteed anything. He knew by now that it did not, but because the working was the only response available to him that was consistent with being alive and being the person he was. The road was still long. The room in Salon was still years away, but the man who would write there was already fully made. Chapter 4. The Second Life. There is a kind of stability that only becomes possible after a person has lost everything once. Not the confidence of someone who has never been tested. Not the ease of someone who has never watched the ground give way. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The stability of someone who knows exactly what the worst feels like, and who has decided, with full knowledge of that, to build again anyway. When Nostradamus arrived in Salon de Provence, sometime around 1544, he was 40 years old. He had been on the road, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 decades. He had practiced medicine in plague towns and university towns and the households of scholars. He had built a life in Agen and watched it taken apart. He had spent years moving without a fixed destination, carrying his knowledge and his grief and the particular endurance that both of those things had built in him. Salon was a small town in the heart of Provence, not far from where he had grown up, close enough to the landscape of his childhood that something in the quality of the light and the smell of the air must have felt like a kind of return. It was not a grand city. It was not a centre of learning or political power. It was a place where a man could set down his bag and look around and ask whether this was somewhere he could stay. He decided it was. He remarried in 1547. His second wife was Anne Ponsard, a widow from a family with established roots in the community. Anne does not appear dramatically in the historical record. No letters of hers have survived. No account of her own thoughts or feelings has come down to us. What we know of her, we know largely from the edges of documents about him, from the household she ran, from the provision he made for her in his will, from the occasional reference in letters where her name appears as context rather than subject, but context, in a life like his, was everything. Here is what the record tells us about Anne that matters more than any dramatic detail could. When he died, in 1566, he left a will that was precise and careful and thoughtful in the way that a man's will is when he has genuinely considered what each person in his life needs, rather than simply dividing property by formula. He provided for each of his 6 children with the attention of someone who had thought about them as individuals. And for Anne, the provision was substantial, practical, and organized in a way that reflected 2 decades of watching her manage a household that his work had required to run in a very particular way. Quietly, competently, with a minimum of disruption to whatever he was doing in the study, a man who had lost everything once and built it back a second time does not organize his will carelessly. The care he took with Anne's provision is a document of a relationship that lasted 20 years and held. She gave him 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. The household in Salon became, for the first time in his adult life, something that lasted. He returned to medicine with the intensity that the Salon years document clearly. Plague returned to the region multiple times during the 1540s and 1550s, and his response was the same as it had always been. He went toward it. His reputation grew. There are accounts from people in the towns he served during these outbreaks that describe him in terms that go beyond ordinary professional respect. The language of people who had watched him work in conditions that drove other physicians away and had drawn their own conclusions about what kind of man he was. But something else was happening during these years in Salon, something that had been present in earlier periods of his life, but had not yet found its full expression. He was writing. The first thing he published was not prophecy. This is important, and it is almost always skipped over in the popular accounts. He published a translation of a classical medical text. He published a book of recipes, household remedies, and cosmetic preparations that combined practical instruction with the kind of learned commentary that an educated readership of the era expected from someone with his background. These were not the works of a mystic. They were the works of a professional man who understood that there was a market for practical knowledge and who had the background to produce it at a level the market would respect. Then he began publishing the almanacs. An almanac in the 16th century was a practical document, a calendar combining astronomical information with forecasts for the coming year, predictions about weather, harvests, the likely health conditions of different seasons. Nostradamus began publishing his own almanacs around 1550. They were successful immediately. His background in astronomy and medicine gave him genuine credibility in the two areas that almanac readers cared most about. Some contemporaries treated the almanacs as credible within the standards of the genre. Available accounts suggest that his readership grew year by year, returning in the way that readers return to a publication they find genuinely useful. Whether that credibility reflected genuine predictive accuracy, or simply the confidence that a well-written and authoritative publication naturally generates, is a question the historical record does not answer cleanly. What it does tell us is that he was a man with genuine expertise, applying that expertise consistently, and that people were paying attention. This is the context that is almost always missing from accounts of how he came to write the prophecies. He did not wake up one morning seized by a vision and reach for a quill. He was a professional writer with a growing audience, working in an established genre, who had spent years developing the voice and the readership that would receive his most ambitious work. The almanacs were not a prelude to the real thing. They were the commercial and intellectual foundation on which the real thing was built. He understood what his audience wanted. They wanted to know what was coming. They wanted to feel that the uncertainty of the future, the unpredictability of weather and health and political fortune that made life in the 16th century genuinely precarious, could be made legible by someone with the right knowledge and the right methods. He had understood this need for a long time, from the household that had taught him to read what was really there, from the plague towns where uncertainty was so thick you could feel it in the air, from the years after Agen, when he had learned in the most personal possible way what it felt like to have the future arrive without warning and take everything. He was sitting in his study in Salon, surrounded by his books and his correspondence and the steady sound of a household that was, finally, working. The children were growing. The practice was established. The almanacs were selling. Anne was managing the mornings, so the mornings were available to him. He was ready to write something larger. He just did not know yet that what he was about to write would still be read 5 centuries after the candle on his desk had burned down to nothing. Chapter 5. The Centuries. What he actually wrote. What follows in this chapter is an attempt to describe what the text actually is, before saying anything more about what it has been claimed to be. The quatrains discussed here are presented as historical and scholarly objects, not as confirmed prophecies. That distinction matters, and it is one we intend to hold throughout. The work that made him famous was called Les Propheties, which translates as The Prophecies. It was published in stages, with the first partial edition appearing in 1555. Additional material appeared in 1557, and the most complete edition came out in 1568, 2 years after his death. The complete work contains 942 4-line verses called quatrains, organized into groups of 100. Each group is called a century, which is why the work is often referred to as the centuries. The language of the quatrains is a deliberate mixture. He wrote primarily in an archaic form of French, but he folded in Latin phrases, Greek words, Provençal terms, invented words, anagrams, and sentence constructions that do not follow the standard rules of any of the languages involved. Subjects are omitted. Pronouns refer to antecedents that are not clearly established. The imagery is compressed to the point where multiple interpretations are possible at almost every line. This is not the result of a man writing beyond the limits of his ability. He was a scholar of considerable depth by the standards of his milieu, fluent in Latin and Greek, and steeped in the classical literature that formed the foundation of educated European thought in the 16th century. The difficulty of the quatrains was not accidental. It was constructed. Why would a man deliberately write in a way that made his meaning as difficult as possible to determine? There are two honest answers, and both are true at the same time. The first is one that anyone who has read the preceding chapters will already understand. He was a man who had grown up in a converso household, been questioned by the Inquisition, and watched people with Jewish origins face consequences for things they had said or written or been accused of saying. He was writing in the 1550s about politics, religion, the fate of kingdoms and dynasties and the church itself, any of those topics, handled directly and clearly, could attract the kind of attention that ended careers at best and ended lives at worst. Ambiguity was a protective layer. The second answer is the one that the popular accounts tend to skip past entirely. He was writing for a market. The almanacs had already demonstrated that there was a readership for predictive writing, and that readership rewarded a certain quality of productive vagueness. A prediction specific enough to feel significant, but ambiguous enough to apply to multiple situations, was commercially more durable than a prediction that named names and dates and could be definitively proven wrong before the year was out. Now let us talk about where the content came from. The scholarship here is important and almost entirely absent from the popular accounts. The historian and Nostradamus researcher Peter Lemesurier spent decades examining the sources that appear in recognizable form in the quatrains, his findings, documented in works including The Unknown Nostradamus and Nostradamus Bibliomancer, trace the content of many quatrains back to a specific body of existing literature that Nostradamus had access to and had clearly read. The primary sources include a work by Richard Roussat called Livre de l'État et Mutations des Temps, published in 1550, which laid out a detailed system of historical cycles based on planetary periods. Another significant source is a body of late classical and medieval prophecy that circulated in manuscript form, and that a man with his scholarly background would have had no difficulty finding and reading. He was not transcribing these sources. He was working with them the way a sophisticated writer works with source material, taking structures and images and scenarios and recasting them in his own compressed and ambiguous verse form, filtered through his own understanding of astrology, history, and the political circumstances of his own time. The method he described for arriving at the prophecies, in the letters and prefaces he attached to the published editions, involved a combination of astrological calculation and what he characterized as divine illumination. He mentioned a bowl of water and candlelight as part of his practice. These elements appear in his own description of his method. How literally we should read them remains a matter of scholarly debate, and it is worth remembering that the description comes from him rather than from independent witnesses. Whether he was describing a literal practice, a recognized symbolic framework that his readers would understand, or something in between, is a question the documents themselves do not resolve with finality. What we can say is that the method, however it actually worked, was the product of a deeply informed mind that had been thinking about these questions for decades before sitting down to write the quatrains. Now let us look at the structure of the quatrains themselves. The quatrains almost never contain specific dates. When temporal references appear, they are typically expressed in terms of astrological configurations, or in language that can be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the framework the reader brings. This is not a minor stylistic detail. It is the structural feature that makes it possible to apply the quatrains to almost any historical period. Proper names in the quatrains are constructed with similar flexibility. Some appear to be recognizable historical figures. Some are anagrams. Some are place names that have been modified or partially disguised. The interpreter who comes to the text looking for a particular figure will almost always find something that can be made to fit, because the text provides enough material and enough ambiguity that the finding is largely a function of what is being sought. He published the first edition in 1555. The preface he attached to it, written as a letter to his infant son Caesar, is one of the most personal documents he left behind. He does not, in that letter, make the sweeping claims about omniscient prediction that the mythology has made on his behalf. He says the prophecies extend far into the future. He says they were arrived at through astronomical calculation and divine inspiration. He asks his son not to try to understand them in the present, because the time for their understanding has not come. This is not the voice of a man claiming to have seen everything. It is the voice of a man making a very long-term argument about the relationship between human history and an order of meaning that exceeds what any single moment can make visible. Whether that argument is valid is a question we are not going to answer for you tonight. What we are going to say is that understanding the argument he was actually making is more honest and more interesting than the version in which he simply predicted specific events and was either right or wrong. The actual argument is a philosophical one about time and pattern and the limits of human knowledge. He published the first edition, and the book went into the world. And the world, which had been waiting for exactly this kind of text without knowing it, responded with an appetite that surprised even him. The Queen of France wanted to meet him. The Inquisition was watching, and the quiet man in the stone house in Ceylon was about to discover that fame, like plague, does not distinguish between the situations a person is prepared for and the ones they are not. Chapter 6. The Court of Catherine de Medici. Power, at its most sophisticated, does not announce itself through force. It operates through information, through the person who understands the landscape of the possible more completely than their advisers and their enemies, who sees what others are not yet seeing, and who uses that understanding to stay alive and to keep the people they love alive in a world that is actively working against both. Catherine de Medici was that kind of person, and when she arranged for Nostradamus to come to Paris in 1555, she was not acting on superstition alone. She was acting, at least in significant part, on the same cold intelligence that had kept her alive through decades of a French court that would have destroyed a less capable woman long before she had the chance to become dangerous. To understand the meeting, you have to understand who Catherine actually was in 1555. She had come to France from Florence at the age of 14 to marry Henry, the second son of King Francis I. The marriage had been arranged for political and financial reasons, as all royal marriages were, and from the beginning it placed her in a position of considerable vulnerability. She was Italian in a court that did not especially like Italians. She was a Medici, which meant she came from banking and commerce rather than from the pure aristocratic bloodlines. The French nobility considered the only legitimate source of standing, and for the first decade of her marriage she failed to produce children, which in the 16th century was not a private misfortune but a public failure with direct political consequences. She survived all of it. The children eventually came, and the succession was secured. But the years of vulnerability had taught her something that people who are never threatened rarely learn so thoroughly: that nothing is guaranteed, that the position you occupy can be taken from you faster than you built it, that the only reliable protection is understanding the situation more completely than anyone else in the room. Henry had become king in 1547. Catherine had become queen. The court of Henry II was a complicated place for her, shaped in part by the presence of Diane de Poitiers, Henry's longtime mistress, a woman 20 years older than the king, who had held his devotion with a consistency that said something about the limits of Catherine's influence over her own husband. She was not powerless. She was never powerless. But she operated in a court where the forms of power were very specific, and she had learned to work with every available instrument. The almanacs of Nostradamus had reached Paris. They had circulated among the educated readership of the capital with the momentum that interesting publications gather when they combine genuine intellectual content with the appeal of the predictive. Catherine was a reader and a collector of intelligence in the broadest sense. She was aware of him. There is a quatrain in the 1st century of the Prophecies, verse 35, that the tradition has long associated with the death of King Henry II. The verse describes, in the compressed and ambiguous language of all the quatrains, a combat between two figures, a wound to the face, a death that is prolonged and painful. In 1559, Henry II died after a jousting tournament in which a lance splintered and drove a fragment through his visor into his eye. He survived the initial injury, but died after 10 days. The association between this quatrain and this death is one of the most discussed in the entire Nostradamus literature, and it deserves honest treatment. The historian Peter Lemesurier, working from the original French text and examining the claimed connections carefully, notes that the verse requires significant interpretive flexibility before it maps cleanly onto the events of 1559. The imagery that appears to describe a jousting accident can be read that way, but it can also be read in other ways that do not require a jousting accident at all. The connection became visible and convincing after the event had occurred. Whether a reader in 1555, looking at the verse with no knowledge of what was coming, would have pointed to Henry II and said, "That is what this means," is a question the evidence does not answer clearly. What the historical record does support is that Catherine arranged for Nostradamus to come to Paris in 1555, 4 years before her husband's death, with a specific stated purpose. She wanted astrological readings for her children. She had 7 children at this point, including the young Francis, who was heir to the throne, and the futures of these children were her primary concern, as they had been for most of her adult life. The journey from Ceylon to Paris was several hundred miles. Made in the heat of a French summer at the pace that the roads of the era imposed, he was 51 years old and not in robust health. He made the journey because the Queen of France had requested his presence, and because declining the Queen of France was not a realistic option for a man with his background and his vulnerabilities. The meeting that took place has been described in several sources of varying reliability. What the most carefully sourced accounts support is this: he came to the court. He was received with respect. He provided readings for the royal children. The specific content of what he told Catherine about their futures is not reliably documented in any contemporary source, and the versions that appear in later biographical accounts should be treated with appropriate caution about how much has been supplied by tradition rather than recovered from the historical record. What is documented is the outcome in professional and social terms. He was received in a way that constituted a form of royal endorsement, and royal endorsement in 16th century France was not a symbolic distinction. It was practical. It meant that the institution most capable of destroying him had a reason to leave him alone. Accounts suggest he received a substantial payment and the title of counsellor and physician in ordinary to the king. The title was more ceremonial than functional. He was not expected to relocate to Paris or attend the court regularly, but it meant something real. It meant that he was under royal protection. It meant that any future encounter with ecclesiastical authority would be navigated from a position considerably stronger than the one he had occupied before. He returned to Salon. He had been away for approximately 3 months. He was tired from the journey and from the sustained performance of court attendance, which required a kind of social energy that was different from anything his life in Salon demanded. He had what he had come for. Whether what Catherine had received was prophecy or astrological analysis, or simply the reassurance of having consulted the most famous predictive mind in the kingdom, is a question the historical record leaves open. She was too intelligent to have believed, in any simple way, that the stars guaranteed outcomes. She was also intelligent enough to understand that operating with the best available information, including information that others considered mystical, was better than operating without it. The France that he travelled through on his journey to and from Paris was not a stable country. The religious tensions that had been building for a generation had found their way into French society and were producing the conflicts that would eventually become the wars of religion, the catastrophic civil conflicts that would tear the country apart in the decades after his death. He was moving through a country that was beginning to understand that it was heading toward a crisis it did not know how to prevent. He was writing about that crisis, in the compressed and ambiguous language of the quatrains, in ways that could be read as warnings or as patterns or as something else entirely, depending on who was reading and what they most needed to see. He came home to Salon. He sat down at his desk. The children were somewhere in the house. Anne was managing the afternoon the way she managed everything, quietly and without fuss, so that the work could continue. Outside the walls of the house, the kingdom was moving toward the future. He had spent his career trying to describe, without saying directly, what he saw, and the Inquisition was almost at the door. Chapter 7. The Inquisition at his door. To understand what the Inquisition represented in the daily life of Nostradamus, set aside the image that the word tends to produce in a modern imagination, the image of dungeons and dramatic confrontations and the machinery of institutional evil. Those things existed. The Inquisition, when capable of them, and used them. But the experience of living under its attention was not primarily dramatic. It was primarily a condition of the air, a pressure that was always present, a knowledge carried quietly in the background of every day, that what you said and what you wrote and what you were seen to practice was being observed and evaluated by an institution that had both the authority and the willingness to act against you, if the evaluation went the wrong way. He had lived with that pressure his entire life. It was not new in the 1550s. It had been present in the Converso household in Saint-Remy, present in his years of medical practice, present in the complicated relationship between his intellectual interests and the orthodoxy that the Church required. What changed in the years after the publication of the Prophecies was the scale of the attention. He was no longer an interesting provincial physician with some unusual ideas. He was the most widely read predictive writer in France. With a royal patron and an international readership and a body of work that the Church had very specific and historically grounded reasons to find troubling, the tools of divination and prophecy occupied an ambiguous position in Catholic theology of the era. The Church did not deny that the future could be known, at least in principle. The biblical prophets had known it. Saints had received visions. These were not contested. What the Church contested, and what the Inquisition was empowered to investigate, was the source of the knowledge of the future that came through legitimate channels: prayer, divine grace. The orthodox interpretation of Scripture was acceptable. Knowledge that came through astrology, through the consultation of spirits, through practices the Church classified as divination, was not. Nostradamus had described his method as a combination of astrological calculation and divine illumination. The astrological component was already in contested territory. Judicial astrology, the use of astrological analysis to predict the fates of individuals and nations, had a complicated status in Church teaching, alternately tolerated and condemned, depending on the period and the specific authority making the judgment. The claim of divine illumination was safer in principle, but more vulnerable in practice, because a claim of divine inspiration from a man with converso origins and a history of practicing medicine in ways that contradicted orthodox authority was a claim that invited scrutiny. The historical record indicates that he was called to respond to ecclesiastical authorities at some point in the early 1560s. The precise circumstances, the specific charge, the exact location and date are not fully established in the documents that have survived, and the accounts that do exist require careful handling. What the available sources suggest, without the certainty that some popular accounts claim, is that there was a period of institutional attention to his work and his practices, and that the outcome did not result in prosecution or punishment. The most plausible explanation for this outcome is the political one. Catherine de' Medici's protection was real, and it was known. An ecclesiastical proceeding against the Queen's designated counsellor would have required either a confrontation with the Crown or the Crown's withdrawal of protection. Neither was straightforward in a France already navigating the religious tensions that would soon produce open civil war. He was also skilled, by this point in his life, at managing institutional attention without providing material that could be used against him. This was a skill developed across decades of operating in spaces where the wrong answer to the wrong question carried serious consequences. He knew how to be sufficiently orthodox in his public statements while maintaining, in the actual work, the productive ambiguity that made the work valuable. The language of the quatrains was designed, in part, for exactly this situation, a verse written in archaic mixed language syntax, describing events through symbolic imagery and without specific attributions, was genuinely difficult to prosecute as heresy or illegal divination. What specific claim was being made? What specific event was being predicted? What specific method was being employed? These were the questions a prosecutor would need to answer to build a case. And they were precisely the questions that the text of the quatrains was constructed to resist answering. He had contemporaries who were less fortunate, men whose ideas or whose origins attracted institutional attention without the protection he had assembled, men who faced consequences for things that were not obviously different from what he was doing, except in the degree of protection that surrounded the doing. He was aware of this. The awareness is visible in the care he brought to everything he published. There is a version of his story that casts him primarily as a courageous voice speaking truth in the face of institutional power. That version captures something real. He did say things that the institutions of his era found uncomfortable. He did walk into plague towns when other physicians walked away. But the complete version includes the calculation, the careful management of exposure, the royal patron cultivated with full understanding of what that protection was worth, the language constructed to communicate while resisting prosecution. He was not a martyr, and he did not intend to be one. He had seen what martyrdom looked like from close enough to know that it was not primarily noble. It was primarily painful, and he had work to finish. Outside the window, the stars moved through their patterns. Inside the house, the children slept, and the man who had spent his life learning to say difficult things safely kept writing, one careful line at a time, into the dark. Chapter 8. The Myths We Made. There is a moment that occurs in the life of almost every historical figure who becomes a symbol. The moment when the symbol separates from the person, when the needs of the people doing the remembering become larger than the facts of what actually happened, when the story that people need to tell becomes more powerful than the story that the evidence supports. For Nostradamus, that moment came quickly. It may have begun before he died. If we are going to take him seriously, if we are going to treat him as something more than a mirror for whatever the present moment needs to project onto the past, we have to do the thing that is least comfortable but most necessary. We have to look carefully at the myths, not to destroy them for the pleasure of destruction, but because the myths, examined honestly, tell us something genuinely important about who we are and what we need. Something that the myths themselves, taken at face value, can never reveal. The way that Nostradamus' predictions get attached to historical events follows a pattern that the scholars who study this most carefully have a name for. It is called retrofitting, or sometimes postdiction. The process works like this. A major event occurs. People who know the name of Nostradamus go looking in the quatrains for something that resembles what just happened. The quatrains, written in archaic, mixed language, with deliberate ambiguity at every level, provide an enormous surface of possible resemblances. A match is found, or constructed, and shared. The sharing happens faster than the checking. By the time anyone has looked carefully at whether the match actually holds up, the connection has already embedded itself in popular memory as fact. This is not a process that requires bad faith on the part of the people doing it. Most of them are genuinely looking for something real. They are operating from a completely understandable human impulse, the impulse to find meaning in catastrophe, to believe that what just happened was not random, that someone somewhere understood it was coming, that the chaos of the present has been accounted for in some larger order. That impulse is worth taking seriously. We will come back to it, but first the specific cases. because the specific cases are where the evidence actually lives. The case of Hitler is one of the most widely repeated examples of Nostradamus' prediction, and it is one of the clearest illustrations of how retrofitting works. The quatrain most commonly cited in connection with Hitler is from the 2nd century. Verse 24. In various translations, it refers to a figure associated with a region that sounds like it could be Austria, a name in the original French that reads as Hister, an imagery involving war and rivers and the fall of a great leader. The connection to Hitler depends primarily on that word Hister, which the popular accounts present as Nostradamus, writing Hitler's name with a single letter changed. Here is what the careful examination of the text actually shows. Hister is a classical Latin name for the lower Danube River. It appears in classical texts that Nostradamus, with his education in Latin and Greek, would have known well. The word is a geographical reference, not a personal name, and its appearance in the quatrain fits the pattern of classical geographical allusion that runs throughout the centuries. The connection to Hitler requires reading a Latin river name as a slightly misspelled version of a 20th century German surname. In the context of a verse that provides enough additional imagery to seem relevant to the Second World War, if you approach it looking for that relevance and are willing to stretch the interpretation far enough to find it. Lemesurier, working through the original French texts with the care of someone who reads 16th century French without the distortions that translation introduces, notes that the Hitler connection is among the weakest in the entire tradition of Nostradamus interpretation. It became popular in the 1930s and 1940s, when people on both sides of the conflict were using the quatrains for their own purposes. Historical accounts suggest that propaganda material using Nostradamus circulated on multiple sides during this period. The quatrains were flexible enough to support all of those claims simultaneously, which tells you something precise about what the quatrains actually are. The case of the September of 2001 attacks is more recent and more thoroughly documented, which makes it easier to trace exactly how the myth was constructed. In the days and weeks after those attacks, several quatrains began circulating online as evidence that Nostradamus had predicted what happened. Some of the verses being shared were genuine quatrains from the centuries. Some were not. One of the most widely shared was a verse that had been written not by Nostradamus, but by a student named Neil Marshall, who had composed it years earlier as a demonstration of how easy it was to construct a convincing-sounding Nostradamus prediction. The verse was shared without its context and was believed by a very large number of people to be authentic. This is documented and not disputed. The original context of that verse is still findable for anyone curious enough to look. The verse that millions of people shared as proof that Nostradamus had predicted those attacks was written by a student in the 1990s as an illustration of how the genre works. The genuine quatrains that were cited in connection with those events require the same interpretive flexibility as the Hitler example. Imagery of fire and towers and a great city and a new war can be mapped onto what happened if you approach the text looking for that mapping. It can also be mapped onto dozens of other events in the preceding 5 centuries, and was, at various points, by various interpreters who were equally convinced they had found the relevant connection. James Randi, the investigator who spent decades examining claims of the paranormal with the goal of distinguishing genuine phenomena from wishful thinking and fraud, addressed the Nostradamus question directly in his 1993 work, The Mask of Nostradamus. His core argument which holds up well against the scholarship that has followed it, is that the quatrains function as a projective surface rather than a predictive text. They are ambiguous enough, rich enough in imagery, and varied enough in content that a reader who comes to them with a specific event in mind will almost always find something that can be made to fit. The finding feels like discovery. It is actually construction. This does not mean Randi's account is the complete account. He was a skeptic with a rhetorical agenda of his own, and his treatment of Nostradamus sometimes underestimates the genuine complexity of the historical and literary questions involved. But his core methodological point, that the only honest test of a predictive claim is whether the prediction was made and understood before the event rather than after it, is not seriously challenged by anyone who has looked at the evidence carefully. The COVID pandemic of 2020 produced the same pattern that every major crisis has produced going back to the earliest decades of the Prophecies publication. Quatrains circulated online, some authentic, some not, with claimed connections to a global plague and specific regions affected. The circulation happened faster than the checking. The connections, when examined by people who actually read the original French, did not hold up, but the need that drove the circulation was real. There is one more case that deserves honest treatment, because it is the one where the popular account and the careful scholarship are most directly in tension. The death of Henry II is the case most often presented as the clearest proof of genuine predictive accuracy. The quatrain was published 4 years before the jousting accident. The accident occurred. The imagery of a combat and a wound to the face is present in the verse. The timing is specific enough to be striking. The honest assessment is that this case is genuinely more complicated than the others. Lemesurier acknowledges that this case requires more careful argument to dismiss than the clear fabrications. The imagery is specific enough that the coincidence, if it is a coincidence, is a notable one. What the careful assessment also notes is this: jousting accidents involving serious injuries and fatalities were not rare in the 16th century. The sport was dangerous and well documented as such. A prediction that a prominent nobleman might die or be gravely injured in a jousting combat was not a prediction of a highly improbable event. Whether Nostradamus identified Henry II specifically, in advance, as the person to whom this would happen, is a question the text does not answer clearly. We are telling you this not to take something away from him. We are telling you this because the honest version of this case is more interesting than the version in which he simply saw the future. A man with deep knowledge of court culture, of the political vulnerabilities of a specific king, of the dangers of a specific sport practiced in a specific way, making a prediction that turned out to be relevant to events in that world, is a more interesting figure than a mystic who received images of things he had no ordinary way of knowing. The former requires a mind of genuine power. The latter requires only a supernatural gift. Genuine minds of genuine power are rarer, and more worth understanding. The myths that have accumulated around Nostradamus across 5 centuries are not primarily about him. They are about us, about the specific form that the need for meaning takes in human minds confronted with chaos and uncertainty and loss on a scale that ordinary frameworks cannot absorb. Every generation that has faced a catastrophe large enough to overwhelm the ordinary structures of meaning has reached for something that promised to have seen it coming, not because the seeing would have prevented it, but because the alternative, a universe in which catastrophe arrives without warning and without pattern, is a universe that human beings find very difficult to inhabit without some form of compensation. Nostradamus is one of the compensations. He has been one of the primary compensations available to the Western world for 500 years, because his text is constructed in exactly the way a compensatory text needs to be constructed, ambiguous enough to be applied to almost anything, rich enough to feel meaningful, old enough to carry the authority of historical distance, famous enough that everyone already knows the name before the crisis arrives. Understanding this does not make him less interesting. It makes him more interesting, because the question it opens is not whether he was right about the future. The question it opens is why the human need for exactly what he provided has not diminished in 5 centuries of scientific progress and the accumulation of knowledge that was supposed to make this kind of thing unnecessary. That question does not have an easy answer, but it is the question his story is actually asking. Chapter 9. What he got right, honestly assessed. After everything in the previous chapter, it would be easy to draw a clean conclusion, to say that the myths have been examined and found wanting, that the retrofitting has been documented, that the honest assessment of the evidence leaves very little standing. That conclusion would be too clean. It would trade one kind of dishonesty for another. So let us look carefully at what the record actually supports, and let us do it with the same patience we have tried to bring to everything else in this account. The first thing to acknowledge is that the almanacs, the annual publications that preceded and accompanied the prophecies, have a demonstrably different character from the quatrains, and that character is almost entirely absent from the popular discussion of Nostradamus. The almanacs were written in a much more direct style, with specific predictions about seasonal weather patterns, the likely health conditions of particular months, astrological configurations, and their probable effects on agricultural and civic affairs. They were the kind of predictions that could be evaluated against observable outcomes within a year of their publication, and a number of his contemporaries did exactly that. Some contemporaries treated the almanacs as credible within the standards of the genre. Available accounts suggest that his readership grew year by year. Returning in the way that readers return to a publication they find genuinely useful. Whether that credibility reflected genuine predictive accuracy or simply the confidence that an authoritative and well-written publication naturally generates, is a question the historical record does not answer cleanly. What it does tell us is that he was a man with genuine expertise, applying that expertise consistently and seriously, and that people who were in a position to evaluate his work chose to keep reading it. The second area where honest assessment finds something worth taking seriously is the general pattern of his political observation. Distinct from the specific event predictions that the popular tradition focuses on, his quatrains, read in the context of the France of the 1550s and 1560s, show a consistent engagement with the political and religious tensions of his era that goes beyond generic prophecy. He was writing about the religious conflicts that were tearing France apart, about the vulnerability of the Valois dynasty, about the pressures building in French society that would eventually produce catastrophic civil war. He was applying a sophisticated understanding of the political landscape to a projection of where those forces were likely to lead. In his assessment of this body of work, the historian Stephane Gerson, whose book Nostradamus, How an Obscure Renaissance Astrologer Became the Modern Prophet of Doom, is among the most carefully researched accounts of his legacy. Notes a consistent preoccupation with civil and religious conflict and dynastic instability that proved genuinely prescient about the direction French history was about to take. Gerson's reading suggests this prescience came not from supernatural insight, but from an unusually careful and honest reading of the present. The rest of the conclusion follows from that foundation. A man who reads the present more accurately than most will project a future that looks more accurate than most, even without any gift beyond clear-eyed observation. This is the accuracy of the experienced physician who has spent years watching how conditions develop and can make reasonable projections about likely outcomes, not because he has supernatural insight, but because his observational base is deeper and more carefully organized than most people's. The third area involves a smaller number of cases in the quatrains where the connections to historical events are less easily dismissed than the clear retrofitting examples. Where the imagery is specific enough, and the historical match close enough, that careful argument is needed rather than simple dismissal. The honest position on these cases is the position the evidence actually supports. They are interesting. They are not conclusive. They cannot be used to establish supernatural predictive ability. Because a small number of specific matches embedded in a body of nearly 1,000 highly ambiguous verses cannot be separated from the effects of chance and interpretive flexibility. But they cannot be dismissed with the same confidence that the clear fabrications warrant. Staying with that complexity, rather than resolving it too quickly in either direction, is the honest response. There is a fourth dimension that rarely appears in either the credulous or the skeptical accounts, and it may be the most important one. He was right, in a very general and very important sense, about one thing that required no supernatural gift to see, but required considerable courage to say. He was right that the world of the 1550s was not stable, that the institutions people were organizing their lives around were more fragile than they appeared, that the religious and political tensions visible in the France and Europe of his day were going to produce conflicts of a scale and severity that the comfortable assumptions of the period did not account for. The wars of religion that began in France in 1562, 2 years before his death, killed vast numbers of people and lasted for more than 30 years. They destroyed communities, ended dynasties, and reshaped the religious landscape of Europe in ways still visible today. The Valois dynastie, which seemed so established and so permanent in the France of 1555, was extinct by 1589. The certainties of the 16th century turned out to be as fragile as the certainties of every other century. He said this, in the only language available to him, the language of oblique and protected prophecy, at a time when saying it directly would have been dangerous. He was not the only person who saw it, but he was one of the very few who found a way to say it in a form that reached a large audience, and that the audience could receive without the discomfort of being told directly that everything they trusted was about to come apart. This is the thing he got right that matters most. Not the specific verse and the specific event, the general and accurate reading of a world in transition, expressed in a form that made the reading accessible without making it fatal. He was a physician who had spent his life reading symptoms. He applied the same skill to a civilization that was showing symptoms that no one in authority wanted to acknowledge. The honest assessment of Nostradamus is not that he was a fraud or that he was a prophet. It is that he was an extraordinarily capable and well-informed observer of his world, who found a form for his observations that has proved uniquely durable and uniquely available to the projective needs of every subsequent generation. A more complicated thing to be than either a fraud or a prophet, and in the end, a more interesting one. Chapter 10. The Man Behind the Myth. When you have spent a long time inside someone else's story, when you have followed them through plague towns and royal courts and institutional danger and the slow physical contraction of old age, there comes a moment when the analysis has to stop and the person has to simply be allowed to exist. This is that moment. Let the pace slow. Let the study in salon come back into focus. Not the famous man, not the prophet, not the figure whose name still circulates in every crisis. The man who woke in the mornings in a house that smelled of herbs and ink, who felt the gout in his joints before he was fully awake, who dressed carefully and went to his study and found the correspondence waiting, as it always was. He answered many of those letters. Not all. The volume was too large, and his time too limited. But the letters he did answer, a portion of which have survived and been examined by historians, show a man who was more modest in private than the public legends suggested. He used the conditional. He offered observations rather than certainties. He distinguished between what he believed he could address with reasonable confidence and what exceeded his ability to know. The private man was more careful than the public myth, more human, more aware of his own limits. Anne moved through the house around him. She had been doing this for nearly 20 years by the time his health was declining seriously in the early 1560s, and the household ran with the particular smoothness of a domestic arrangement that has had time to find its natural rhythms. On the mornings when the correspondence was heavy, the house was quiet. On the days when patients came, the patients were managed. On the evenings, when 6 children needed what children need, the children were taken care of. A household with 6 children and a husband whose work required conditions of sustained concentration does not run quietly in the background by accident. Someone makes the decisions that keep all of those things from colliding. Anne made those decisions. Every day, for 20 years, in a house where history was being made in one room while ordinary life was being sustained in all the others, what the record tells us about Anne, plainly and without drama, is this. When he died in 1566, the will he left behind was precise and careful and organized in a way that reflected 2 decades of watching her manage what his work required. He provided for each of his children with the attention of someone who had thought about them as individuals. And for Anne, the provision was substantial and practical and forward-looking. He was a man who had thought about what she would need. He was a man who knew exactly what she had been providing. The will, in its careful attention to her situation, is a document of a relationship that lasted 20 years and held. It is not a love letter. It is more durable than a love letter. It is evidence. His son Caesar was growing up in these years. The boy to whom the famous letter in the Prophecies had been addressed when Caesar was an infant too young to read it. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A father writing a letter to his newborn son about the nature of time and prophecy and divine illumination, knowing the boy will not read it for decades, knowing the letter is also addressed to the ages, and then living in the same house as that boy, seeing him at the table, hearing him in the garden, watching him slowly become a person who will eventually hold the letter and try to understand it. What does it do to a child to grow up in the shadow of a document that was written for him before he could speak? Caesar would go on to become a historian and civic figure in Salon in his own right, a man of letters who wrote one of the early accounts of his father's life. He described his father with the combination of pride and careful distance that belongs to children whose parents have become, even within the family, partly legend before the death comes. There is affection in what Caesar wrote, and there is the effort of someone trying to see clearly a figure who had already partly disappeared into what the world had made of him. He was elected in June of 1566 as a town councillor of Salon. It is a detail that almost never appears in the popular accounts, but it is one of the most humanizing ones. The most widely read predictive writer in France, the man whose name was spoken in royal courts and whose quatrains were argued over across Europe, attending municipal meetings, engaging with the ordinary business of local governance in a small Provençal town. The people who actually knew him, who had lived in the same town and used the same market and seen him in the street for 20 years, chose him for a practical civic role. They trusted him with the ordinary management of shared public affairs. They were not choosing a prophet. They were choosing a neighbour they respected. His health declined steadily through the early 1560s. The gout progressed from morning stiffness to genuine disability. He spent more time at his desk and less time moving through the town. He kept writing. The almanacs were produced on schedule. The correspondence was answered. The long preface addressed to King Henry II, prepared for later editions of the Prophecies, was written with the care of a man who knew it would be among the most studied documents he left behind. He prepared his will. He died on the 2nd of July, 1566. Jean de Chavigny, his physician and secretary, who was present during the final period, recorded that he was aware his death was near, and that he faced the situation with the steadiness that people who knew him consistently attributed to him in difficult moments. The often repeated story that he predicted his own death precisely, telling Chavigny the night before that he would not be found alive in the morning, appears in sources close enough to the events to take seriously, but not close enough to treat with complete certainty. What the record does support is that he died during the night between the 1st and 2nd of July, 1566, that his death was not unexpected by the people around him, and that he was found in the morning. He was buried in the Church of the Cordeliers in Salon. Anne survived him by several decades. She managed the estate with the competence she had brought to everything. Caesar grew up and wrote about his father and built his own life in the town where his father had been ordinary enough to attend council meetings and extraordinary enough to be consulted by the Queen of France. The candle in the study burned down for the last time. The house went quiet, and the text went into the world and kept going. Chapter 11. 5 Centuries of Fear. There is a pattern that becomes visible when you look at the entire history of how each generation has used Nostradamus, what they have needed him to say, and when his name resurfaces with the greatest force. The pattern is not about the accuracy of specific predictions. It is about conditions, about the moments when the frameworks that people use to make sense of daily life are no longer adequate to what is actually happening. when the future, which normally feels like a continuation of the present, suddenly feels like a wall, Nostradamus returns. Always, when the present feels like it is failing. The Prophecies were published in 1555. Within a decade, France was in the grip of the religious wars that would devastate the country for the next 30 years. The Huguenot and Catholic factions that tore French society apart both read the quatrains looking for confirmation of their positions, for evidence that the movements of history had already decided who would prevail. Both sides found what they were looking for. This is the first instance of what would become the recurring pattern. The text does not create the fear. The fear creates the demand for the text. The French Revolution provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of the pattern in operation. When the ancient regime collapsed in 1789, when the king and the aristocracy and the church were swept aside with a speed that overturned the assumptions of an entire civilization almost overnight, the Prophecies experienced a surge of attention that publishers of the era documented carefully because it was commercially significant. People read the quatrains looking for the revolution. They found it, or believed they found it, in verses about the fall of the great and the blood that would flow in the streets of a great city. The matches required interpretive flexibility, as they always did. The flexibility was provided readily, as it always was, by people who needed the matches to exist. Napoleon's rise and fall produced another surge. The imagery of a conqueror from the south, a man of war who would dominate Europe and then be broken, was mapped onto his career both during his ascendancy and after his defeat. People across Europe were reading the quatrains for Napoleon the same way people had read them for the religious wars, looking for the assurance that what was happening was not random, that it had been anticipated, that the chaos had been accounted for somewhere. The First World War produced the most dramatic surge in Nostradamus' attention before the 20th century was finished. The scale of the killing, the total mobilization of entire societies, the technology of industrialized death that made the conflict unlike anything the previous century had experienced, broke the frameworks that educated Europeans had been using to understand their world. Progress had been the dominant narrative. The war was the decisive argument against it, and in the wreckage of that narrative, people looked for older frameworks that had been describing catastrophe and upheaval all along. The quatrains were there. They had always been there. Picture a woman in Paris in 1917, sitting at a kitchen table with a copy of the Prophecies open in front of her. Her son is somewhere on the Western Front. She has not had a letter in 3 weeks. She is looking for something, anything, that suggests the suffering has been accounted for somewhere, that someone saw it coming, that it is part of a pattern that eventually resolves. She finds a verse that could mean what she needs it to mean. She closes the book. She does not feel better exactly, but she feels less alone in the chaos. That is what the text provides. That is what it has always provided. Not answers. The feeling that the questions have been asked before. The Second World War intensified this. The scale of the conflict. The industrial scale of atrocity. The atomic bomb. The complete transformation of the geopolitical order that had organized the world for centuries, produced a demand for meaning that exceeded even the most resilient, ordinary frameworks. Historical accounts suggest that propaganda material using Nostradamus circulated on multiple sides during the conflict, with each party finding in the ambiguous verses confirmation of their expected victory. That multiple opposing sides could each find confirmation of their own position in the same text is not a testimony to his prophetic power. It is a precise description of what the text actually is and what it actually does. The same verses, different readers, each finding what they most needed to find. The year 2000 brought the pattern to a new kind of visibility. The anxiety around the millennium transition drew heavily on prophetic traditions of all kinds, and Nostradamus was prominent among them. Nothing happened on the scale that was feared. The anxiety did not diminish. It shifted to the next available crisis, and the next, and the next. The COVID pandemic of 2020 brought the pattern into the present with a clarity that no one paying attention could miss. Within days of the World Health Organization declaring a public health emergency, Nostradamus-related content was flooding every major social media platform. Some came from people who genuinely believed they were finding prophetic confirmation. Some came from people exploring the pattern ironically. Some, as we discussed in the previous chapter, was simply fabricated. Verses that had never appeared in any edition of the prophecies were shared as genuine because the sharing was faster than the checking and because the need was real, regardless of whether the specific verse was authentic. The psychologists who study this behavior have several frameworks for understanding it. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous data. It is a feature of human cognition with deep roots, almost certainly because the ability to perceive patterns, even at the cost of sometimes perceiving patterns that are not there, was useful in the environment in which human cognition evolved. The person who perceived a pattern in the rustling of the grass and assumed predator was wrong most of the time, but survived the times when they were right. Terror management theory, developed by the psychologist Sheldon Solomon and his colleagues, building on the work of Ernest Becker, offers another angle: the awareness of mortality, the knowledge that we will die and that the world will continue without us, creates an anxiety that human beings manage through cultural frameworks that give life meaning and place individual death within a larger narrative that continues beyond any individual life. When those frameworks are threatened by mass death or catastrophic disruption, the need for the larger narrative intensifies. Nostradamus provides a larger narrative, not one that resolves the anxiety. The quatrains do not promise that everything will be fine. They promise something different and, for the human need they serve, more useful. They promise that what is happening was anticipated, that the chaos has been seen, that someone, at some point, understood that this was coming. The Internet changed the dynamics of this phenomenon in ways the scholars who study his reception are still working to fully understand. Before the Internet, the circulation of Nostradamus interpretation required the physical production and distribution of books and pamphlets. This created a natural limiting factor on how quickly and how widely any given interpretation could spread. The publisher had to commit resources. The reader had to acquire a physical object. The chain of transmission involved enough steps that some degree of evaluation, however imperfect, was built into the process. The Internet removed those limiting factors entirely. Quatrain, genuine or fabricated, can travel from a single person's screen to millions of screens within hours, carried by the combination of emotional resonance and social sharing that the platforms are engineered to amplify. The speed of transmission is inversely related to the depth of evaluation. He lived through the plague. He lived through the loss of his family. He lived through the Inquisition and the court of Catherine de Medici and the slow physical contraction of his final years. He looked at all of it directly. He wrote about all of it in the only language he could safely use. What he was trying to say, underneath all of the ambiguity and the protective encoding, was something simple and something true. The world is not as stable as it looks. The things you trust are more fragile than you know. The future contains things that the present cannot easily imagine. He is remembered now not because he was right about the specific events the mythology claims he predicted. He is remembered because the world keeps arriving at moments that need what he was providing: the assurance of pattern, the comfort of anticipated catastrophe, the feeling that the chaos was seen coming by someone who was paying the right kind of attention. Whether he actually saw it coming is a question we have spent this entire work examining honestly. The answer, as we have shown, is complicated, but the need that makes the question feel important, that is not complicated at all. That is simply what it feels like to be human in a world that does not explain itself. Chapter 12. The question he left open. Come back to the stone house in Salon. Come back to the small study where the candle burned late, and the bowl of water sat on the table, and the ink dried slowly on the pages of a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to say something true about the relationship between the present and the future, between what we can know and what we cannot, between the order we need the world to have and the order the world actually has. He is gone now. The house is quiet. The correspondence has stopped arriving. The children have grown and moved into their own lives. Anne has outlived him and managed the estate with the competence she brought to everything. The town of Salon has returned to its ordinary rhythms, the market and the church and the slow agricultural calendar of Provence. As if the careful man who wrote his verses and attended his council meetings and answered his letters had simply been part of the texture of the place all along, which is exactly what he had been. What he left behind is still in the world, more in the world now than when he died. It has travelled further and been read by more people and been applied to more crises and argued over by more scholars and shared more times across more platforms than anything else. A man sitting in a stone house in the south of France, in France, the 1550s could reasonably have expected to produce, and the question it leaves open is still open. Not the question of whether specific quatrains predicted specific events. We have examined that question as carefully and as honestly as it can be examined, and the answer, while complicated in its details, is clear enough in its general shape. The popular claims do not survive rigorous scrutiny. The retrofitting pattern is real and well documented. The mythology is not the same as the man. The question that remains open is different. It is older and harder and more personal. The question is this: what do we do with the knowledge that we do not know? He lived his whole life inside that question. It shaped everything he built and everything he lost. He was a physician who understood, from decades of direct experience, that knowledge has limits, that a trained and careful mind can do more than an untrained and careless one, but that the more cannot be extended indefinitely. There is a point at which the disease is stronger than the knowledge and the person dies anyway. He had felt that limit in the most personal way possible, in the house in Agen, where his wife and children died, despite everything he knew. He was a writer who understood that language has limits, that the thing you most want to say is almost always the thing that resists saying most directly, that the attempt to put the largest truths into the smallest containers, into 4 lines of compressed verse, always produces something that is partly what you intended and partly what the form and the ambiguity required you to accept instead. He was a man who understood that time has limits, that the future he was trying to describe was genuinely beyond what any human mind, however trained and however carefully attentive, could actually see with the completeness the mythology claims for him. And he kept writing anyway. Not because he had found the answer to the question of what we do with the knowledge that we do not know, but because the writing was the practice of staying with the question, of refusing to resolve it too early in either direction, of refusing the comfort of the certainty that says yes, I can see it all clearly, and refusing equally the comfort of the certainty that says there is nothing to see. He occupied the uncomfortable middle ground. He had always occupied it. The Converso family, that was officially Catholic and privately something more layered, the physician who practiced medicine by abandoning the official theory while not yet having the better theory that would replace it, the writer who encoded his most serious observations in language deliberately constructed to resist the direct understanding that would have made them safe to say clearly, the middle ground is uncomfortable. That is the point of it. The comfortable positions are the ones at the extremes. The person who finds the prediction of every modern catastrophe in a 16th century verse, and the person who dismisses every connection as the product of credulity and bias, both positions offer the relief of not having to keep looking, of having arrived at a conclusion and being able to stop. The middle ground does not offer that relief. It requires the continued looking, the sustained attention to what the evidence actually shows, rather than what any particular conclusion needs it to show. He is still famous for the wrong reasons. He will probably continue to be famous for the wrong reasons, because the wrong reasons serve needs that the right reasons cannot serve as efficiently. The myth of the omniscient prophet who encoded everything in 450-year-old French verse is more immediately useful than the truth of the careful and complicated man who looked at his world with more honesty than most, and found a form for what he saw that has proved uniquely durable without being uniquely accurate. But the truth is available. It has always been available. It requires more patience than the myth, and it offers less immediate comfort. It offers something else instead. A real person, in a real place, at a real moment in history, making real choices about how to live in a world that is genuinely uncertain, that genuinely does not explain itself, that genuinely cannot be made fully legible by any method yet developed, supernatural or scientific, or anything in between. The real person is more useful than the myth. Not because the real person was better or wiser than the myth, though in some ways he was, but because the real person had to solve the same problem that we have to solve. How do you live carefully and honestly and with genuine attention to what is actually true, inside a world that is changing faster than your frameworks can accommodate, with losses that no knowledge can prevent and futures that no method can make fully visible? He solved it imperfectly, the way all real solutions to real problems are imperfect. He built a life in Salon, and wrote his verses, and answered his correspondence, and saw his patients, and managed the Inquisition, and navigated the court of Catherine de Medici, and watched his children grow, and felt the gout tighten in his joints in the mornings, and wrote one more verse, and then one more, and then one more. He did not give us a system to believe in. he gave us a practice to consider, the practice of looking carefully at what is actually there, of encoding what you see in whatever form protects it and carries it forward, of accepting that the gap between what you can know and what you need to know is permanent, and is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited with as much honesty and as much skill as you can bring to it. That practice is worth more than any specific prediction, worth more than the entire mythology. The river name quatrain, and the tower verse, and the pandemic prophecy, and every other retrofitted connection that the next 5 centuries will generate and believe, and eventually, quietly, revise. Because the practice is available to everyone, it does not require a brass bowl or divine illumination, or the particular endurance of a 16th century physician who had walked through enough plague towns to stop being surprised by the fragility of things. It requires only the willingness to look at what is actually there, and to stay with what you see long enough to understand it, and to find a form for it that is honest enough to be worth passing on. He passed something on. Whatever you think about the prophecies, whatever position you take on the questions we have been examining together tonight, the something is real, the careful observer of a world in crisis, the writer who found a form durable enough to carry his observations across 5 centuries, and through crises he could not have specifically predicted, and into the hands of people he could not have known, would need what he had to say. He left a question open. The question of what an honest and careful mind does with the genuine uncertainty of the future, not the mythological certainty of the prophet, and not the comfortable dismissal of the skeptic, the sustained, honest, uncomfortable, necessary attention of someone who keeps looking because the looking matters, regardless of whether it ever resolves into certainty. That question is yours now. It has always been yours. He just found a way to make sure you could not avoid it. In a sense, he understood why that would happen, not because he saw the future, but because he understood the need. He understood the specific human need that his text would fill, the need to believe that the chaos has been witnessed, that the suffering has been seen, that someone somewhere was paying enough attention to know what was coming, even when nothing could be done to stop it. He built a text that could hold that need for 5 centuries and counting. That is what he actually did. That is what the evidence actually supports. And that, for a man who grew up learning that the most dangerous thing you could do was let the world know exactly what you understood, is more than enough. Good night, and thank you for staying until the end.